My own mother abandoned me at the airport when I was just 15. And if you think that sounds like the kind of nightmare a girl never forgets, you're right, because I stood there with my boarding pass in one hand and my little backpack in the other, watching her disappear into the departure gate with a group of friends, laughing, smiling, rolling her expensive luggage behind her as if I didn't even exist. The worst part was, she didn't even look back. Not once. Not even when I called out, "Mom," in that small, hoarse voice that shattered in my throat, echoing through the terminal while she pretended she didn't hear. In her mind, I wasn't. A daughter in need of safety or love. I was an obstacle to her luxurious vacation, a burden to be cast aside like a forgotten suitcase. In that instant, the cold air of the airport, the stares of strangers, the relentless flight announcements became a prison around me, a memory that would burn into my bones forever. And yet, what she never saw coming was that this single act of betrayal would one day become the reason she'd be brought to her knees in front of me. In a place where laughter turned to silence and her powerful smile cracked into dust. Remember clutching my phone like it was a lifeline, staring at the departure board as if somehow my name would appear there beside hers. Proof that I belonged, that I wasn't just left behind like an old coat tossed aside. 15 years old, with sneakers still dusty from school, and a heart that hadn't yet understood the full weight of betrayal, I stood frozen in that terminal while families bustled around me. Fathers lifting toddlers onto their shoulders, mothers bending down to zip coats, siblings tugging at each other's arms. I had no one. The last glimpse I had of her was the swing of her silk scarf as she vanished into the crowd. Her laughter carried back to me like glass shattering. It wasn't the kind of laughter that belonged to a mother who had responsibilities. It was the sharp, carefree cackle of someone shedding their skin, running toward indulgence without the weight of consequence. The airport intercom announced delays and gate changes, but none of it registered because my world had already been delayed, rerouted, grounded. I remember my throat tightening, willing her to return, to realize her mistake, to call out my name, in that affectionate tone she used in front of her friends when she wanted to prove she was the cool mom. But minutes stretched into hours, and all I had was the bench near baggage claim where I sat small and invisible, fighting the urge to cry because somehow I knew even then that tears would only make me look weaker, more pathetic. Strangers glanced at me, some with sympathy, some with annoyance, as if my pain was an inconvenience in their otherwise smooth journeys. A security guard eventually asked if I was waiting for someone, and my voice cracked when I lied. "She'll be right back." But deep down, I knew she wouldn't, because for my mother, the thrill of luxury had always come first, even before. This airport, before that day, she'd been the woman who measured her worth in handbags and hotel suites, who scrolled travel blogs at the dinner table while I reheated leftovers for myself. She wasn't the kind of mother who remembered school, projects, or birthdays, unless she could turn them into Instagram-worthy moments, and I should have seen it coming. I should have understood that the trip she'd been planning with her wealthy friends never had a seat for me, that when she said, "We'll see if there's room," what she meant was, "Don't get your hopes up." But hope was all I had, and that day it abandoned me as swiftly as she did, boarding a plane I was never meant to step on. What I couldn't know then was that this abandonment would be the seed of something much bigger. A storm building, silently inside me, waiting years to break. And when it finally did, she wouldn't be laughing. She wouldn't be rolling her designer luggage behind her. She would be standing in silence, her face pale, her perfect image crumbling, while I held every ounce of control she thought I'd never have. I sat in that terminal long enough for the fluorescent lights above me to hum louder than the voices in my head, long enough for my phone battery to dip to red and for my body to ache from the hard plastic chair, but no amount of waiting made her appear, and eventually a kind airline employee brought me a bottle of water and a pack of crackers while asking if I needed someone to call. And I lied again, forcing a smile, insisting I was fine, because even at 15 I understood that if I admitted the truth, if I said out loud that my own mother had left me like discarded luggage, it would break something inside me that could never be repaired. So I swallowed my pride along with those dry crackers, each bite sticking in my throat as if my body itself was rejecting the reality. And when the night came, I curled up on that airport bench pretending I was just another traveler caught in a layover. But the difference was, everyone else had a destination, and I had only emptiness. And as the years passed, I kept replaying that night like a broken reel. The cold seat, the smell of coffee, the sound of wheels dragging suitcases across tile, and I carried it with me into every classroom, every friendship, every relationship, a hidden weight pressed against my chest, shaping me into someone cautious, someone who knew how fragile trust really was. And when people asked about my childhood, I learned to paint over the cracks, to laugh lightly and say my mother was busy, that she traveled a lot, that she had a glamorous life, but beneath the surface, there was rage, a quiet kind of rage that sharpened me, that taught me to study her patterns, to memorize the way she smiled at strangers and lied to family, to watch her climb her social ladder with manicured nails while I stood invisible at the bottom. And when I turned 18 and finally had the legal freedom to walk away, I didn't slam doors or scream. I simply disappeared. And that silence was my first act of power, because what she didn't understand was that neglect breeds independence. Abandonment breeds strength, and by the time I reappeared years later, in a place where she least expected, me in a courtroom filled with her peers and her so-called friends, the girl she left behind at 15 had grown into a woman holding every receipt, every scar, every proof of who she really was. And when her eyes locked on mine across the polished wooden benches, for the first time in her life, she couldn't laugh her way out, couldn't charm her way back, because I was no longer her daughter begging to be seen. I was her reckoning. She always thought her beauty and her connections were shields, that no matter how cruel or careless she was, the world would still bend to her smile. But she didn't realize that those very qualities were fragile glass, and when they shattered, the cuts would be deeper than she ever imagined. Because when I walked into that courtroom, calm, collected, dressed in the kind of tailored suit she would never have expected me to afford, I carried not just my own pain, but a lifetime of evidence she had scattered carelessly behind her, canceled payments on bills she swore she'd covered, medical, records showing neglect, text messages where she bragged to friends about leaving me behind, because a teenager ruins the vibe, and every detail she dismissed as unimportant had become a weapon in my hands. And the look on her face as the judge began to read through my file was the mirror opposite of that airport day. Because this time I was the one steady, and she was the one unraveling, tugging at her designer sleeves, whispering frantically to her lawyer as if money could erase the truth. But money couldn't change the fact that I had survived her absence. Money couldn't rewrite the nights I spent alone, or the years I taught myself how to cook, budget, work 2 jobs while still finishing school, and it definitely couldn't stop the witnesses I'd gathered. Teachers who remembered my exhaustion, neighbors who saw her vanish for weeks at a time, even one of her old friends who had grown tired of pretending she was perfect, who sat on the stand and admitted under oath that my mother's vacations always came before my meals, her image, always before my safety. And I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't even raise my voice because I wanted her to feel what I had felt. The crushing silence of being powerless, the realization that no one was coming to rescue her, and in that silence she finally saw me, not as the child she abandoned, but as the woman who could no longer be erased. The silence in that courtroom was different from the silence of the airport. It was thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around her like a rope as the judge's words sank deeper. And for the first time, I saw her confidence drain away. Her perfectly painted face losing color while her hands trembled against the polished table, and she tried to speak, to twist the story into something palatable, claiming she had given me freedom, that she trusted me to be independent, that leaving me at 15 was not abandonment but a lesson. But every excuse only dug her deeper, because the evidence was undeniable, and the people around us were no longer dazzled by her practiced charm. They saw the truth written in every document, every testimony, and the irony was that the very luxury she had chosen over me was now being laid bare as proof of her selfishness. The trips she posted on social media, the champagne bottles, the hotel suites, they became exhibits in my case, each photo a reminder that her joy was built on my isolation, her indulgence on my hunger, and while she shifted uncomfortably, begging her lawyer to fix it, I simply sat still, not needing to gloat because the weight of truth was enough. And I thought back to that girl on the airport bench clutching a water bottle and stale crackers, wishing for someone to notice her, and I realized she was gone. She had grown into someone unshakable, someone who didn't need her mother's gaze or approval, and as the judge declared that my claims were validated, that her neglect was recorded in law, I felt a quiet kind of victory. Not loud, not explosive, but steady and undeniable, the kind of victory that lingers, that rewrites the past. And in that moment, I knew she would never escape the shadow of what she had done, because every time she looked at me from that day on, she would be forced to remember not the daughter she abandoned, but the reckoning she created. She broke down in ways I never thought I would see. Her manicured nails digging into her palms, her voice cracking as she begged the judge to understand, trying to shift blame onto circumstance, onto me, onto anyone but herself. And yet each word only exposed her further, because the courtroom wasn't fooled by crocodile tears. They saw the pattern, the deliberate choices, the abandonment that wasn't a mistake but a habit. And as her lawyer scrambled with paperwork, I noticed the eyes of the gallery fixed on her with a mixture of pity and disgust. The very social circle she had once fought to impress now witnessing her humiliation. And the irony was sharper than any blade, because the vacations, the handbags, the glittering dinners she had chased for status now became her downfall, printed in glossy photos and receipts entered as exhibits against her. And when the ruling came, restitution, mandated support, a record that could not be wiped away, I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I only exhaled, because this wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. It was about balance. About finally tipping the scales back to where truth could be seen, and as I stood to leave, her eyes followed me, wide and broken, and for the first time since that night in the airport, she reached out, whispering my name, not with authority, but with desperation, and I paused, only for a second, remembering the 15-year-old girl who had begged for that same recognition. And then I turned and walked away, my heels steady on the floor, because I no longer needed her acknowledgement. I no longer needed her apology. I had built my own life, carved out my own strength, and she was nothing more than a chapter closed, a ghost that could no longer haunt me. And with each step toward the doors, I felt the weight of years fall from my shoulders, replaced by something stronger, something untouchable. Freedom. Freedom didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came in the quiet realization that I no longer had to flinch at the thought of her, no longer had to shrink when someone asked about my family, because now the truth was documented, sealed, undeniable. And I carried that truth like armor, not to hurt anyone else, but to remind myself I was no longer the girl waiting on a cold bench for a mother who never came back. I was the woman who had stood against her and won. And as I stepped out of the courthouse, the air felt different, cleaner somehow, the sunlight falling across my face like a new beginning. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel like a forgotten suitcase left behind. I felt solid, seen, whole. And the people who had once doubted me, who had whispered that maybe I exaggerated, now looked at me with something closer to respect, because I hadn't just survived, I had forced the truth into the open. And in doing so, I had broken the cycle she thought would define me. And though part of me wanted to collapse under the weight of it all, I kept walking, knowing that each step was a promise to myself, that I would never allow her or anyone else to erase me again, that the life I built from here on out would be mine alone, rooted not in abandonment, but in resilience. And while she sat in that courtroom surrounded by papers that read like an indictment of her entire life, I walked into a future where I was no longer her shadow, but my own light. And that was the truest revenge she could never undo. In the weeks that followed, I expected the high of victory to fade, for the old wounds to creep back in and remind me of the emptiness she'd carved into me. But what surprised me was the opposite. The more I carried on with my life, the more I felt that emptiness closing, replaced not by her, not by apologies she would never mean, but by the strength of what I had built on my own. And when I walked into work, when I laughed with friends, when I signed the lease on my own apartment with money I earned, I felt grounded in a way that 15-year-old girl never believed was possible. And though my mother tried to reach out through frantic, Calls, late-night messages dripping with guilt and excuses. I didn't answer, because what could she possibly say that would undo years of silence, years of cold stares and broken promises? And the beauty of it was that I didn't even crave her words anymore. I didn't sit awake wishing she'd explain, because the courtroom had given me something better than her apologies. It had given me proof that I was right, that I hadn't imagined the neglect, that my pain was real and recognized, and that knowledge was enough to finally release me. And so I lived. I truly lived, carrying forward with a sense of calm power, because the past no longer chained me. And when I caught my reflection one morning, hair messy from sleep, eyes steady and unafraid, I realized I wasn't just surviving her absence anymore. I was thriving because of it. And that was the ending she never expected. The life she couldn't take credit for. The life that was mine. Entirely mine. Months slipped into a year, and with each passing day I became more aware of how different my world looked, without her shadow looming over every corner, because when she had power over me, I measured myself by her moods, her silences, her sporadic bursts of affection that felt more like transactions than love. But once that thread was cut, I stopped waiting for her approval and started writing my own story. And it wasn't glamorous in the way she chased. It was simple and quiet, but it was mine. The late nights studying to finish my degree. The mornings, making coffee in a tiny kitchen I could finally call my own. The laughter of friends who became my chosen family. People who showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And slowly, I began to see that my mother's abandonment had given me something she never intended. Because by leaving me behind at 15, she thought she had discarded me. But instead, she had forged me, forced me to grow sharper, stronger, unwilling to break. And when she tried again to worm her way back into my life with promises of change, photos of her tears, voicemails begging for forgiveness, I listened only long enough to understand that nothing had shifted inside her, that her desperation wasn't about love but about image, about saving herself from the loneliness she had once condemned me to. And so I blocked her number and moved forward. And the peace that followed was unlike anything I had ever known, because it was not the peace of pretending everything was fine. It was the peace of knowing I had chosen myself. And with every success I carved out, a job promotion, a new city, a circle of people who truly cared, I realized she would one day hear about it secondhand. Whispers carried back to her about the daughter she had left who no longer needed her, and that quiet reality, that truth she could never rewrite, was the most powerful revenge of all. There came a point when I stopped even thinking of her as my mother, and began to see her simply as a woman who happened to give me life, but nothing of what life truly requires. Because the title of mother is earned through sacrifice, through presence, through the small, everyday choices that build trust. And she had chosen the opposite every single time. And while once that realization would have crushed me, now it only clarified my path, because I no longer chased answers. I no longer replayed the why in my head at night. Instead, I filled my hours with living. Long walks in the evening where the city lights reflected against the river. Dinners with people who laughed until tears fell. Mornings where I woke up knowing no one could yank stability away from me. And in those moments, I finally understood that healing wasn't about her changing or apologizing. It was about me refusing to carry her abandonment like a scarlet letter. And the more I grew, the more her image faded into the background like static on a forgotten channel, until one day I realized I hadn't thought about her in weeks. And that absence felt like freedom, pure and steady, and yet when her name appeared unexpectedly in an article months later, tied to debts, failed friendships, whispers of her reputation crumbling, I didn't feel satisfaction so much as inevitability, because I had seen this end coming from the very first day she chose champagne flutes over her daughter's tears. And though I didn't celebrate her downfall, I also didn't grieve it. I simply closed the tab, breathed deeply, and moved on, carrying into my future the certainty that I was not the girl she abandoned, but the woman she unintentionally forged. And that was more powerful than anything she could have ever given me. Years later, when I stood on the balcony of my own apartment, overlooking a skyline I had built my life beneath, I thought back to that night in the airport, the cold plastic bench, the way my voice cracked when I whispered her name, and it felt like a story that had happened to someone else, some younger version of me who I wanted to reach back through time and comfort, to tell her that she wouldn't always feel small, she wouldn't always ache for someone who chose glitter over love, that one day she would grow into a woman who didn't just survive but thrived, who traveled not out of escape but out of joy, who paid her own way without apology, and I realized that was the revenge she never saw coming. Not the courtroom, not the judgment, not even the public humiliation, but the fact that I no longer carried her absence like an open wound. Because healing itself was the loudest declaration, and though she tried to send letters in later years, carefully written apologies dripping with the same charm she once used to disarm strangers, I kept them unopened in a drawer, not out of hatred, but out of recognition that her words could no longer touch me. And I understood then that my life didn't need closure from her. My life was the closure, the friendships I nurtured, the career I fought for, the laughter that filled rooms she would never enter. And in that clarity, I finally saw that the little girl who once believed being left behind meant being unworthy had grown into someone who defined her worth on her own terms. And that transformation, that unshakable independence, was the legacy she had accidentally given me, because in abandoning me, she taught me that I would never again abandon myself. And so, the story that began with a 15-year-old girl sitting alone on a hard airport bench ended with a woman standing firmly in her own life, no longer defined by the shadows of someone else's choices, but by the strength she forged out of them. Because my mother's abandonment was not the end of me as she might have believed, it was the beginning, the sharp, painful cut that forced me to grow roots in places she never bothered to look, and those roots became the foundation of everything I built, the career I carved out with my own hands, the circle of people who showed me what unconditional care really looked like, the small joys of mornings filled with peace instead of dread, and the bigger triumphs of knowing I had taken control of a story that could have broken me. And when I think back now, I don't picture her laughter in that airport anymore. I picture myself walking away from the courtroom years later, steady, unflinching, free, because that was the moment I understood the truth. Revenge doesn't always look like fire or fury. Sometimes it looks like living well, living fully, living without the chains of someone else's neglect. And that is what I chose, and what I will keep choosing. Because while she will always have to carry the knowledge that she abandoned her daughter for a fleeting vacation, I will carry the proof that her abandonment never defined my worth. It only revealed it. And that is a kind of justice no judge, no jury, no sentence could ever match. It is the justice of becoming whole in spite of her, and that is the ending I claim. Not hers, not ours, but mine.